So let's start by Antonio Gramsci writing from Mussolini's prison cell, labor activist whose work was mostly involved in worker-owned, self-managed workers' enterprises, left social theorist. He discussed how societies tend to develop ideas and beliefs that reflect and support the prevailing structure of power, creating a framework of beliefs and attitudes that becomes what he called hegemonic common sense, something we don't question. We just take for granted, like the air we breathe. It's very useful to consider what we take for granted as unquestionable common sense, what we consent to without reflection, not just what we consent to, but what we often go on to regard as the highest goal of life. So in today's world, one of the highest goals in life is having a job. The best advice that one can give to a young person is to prepare to find employment. That is, to prepare to spend your waking life in servitude to a master. For many, that means subordination to discipline that is far more extreme than in a totalitarian state. So Stalin, for example, had enormous control over his subjects, but he didn't have enough control to tell them that at 3 p.m. you can take a bathroom break for a couple of minutes. Here's the clothes you have to wear all day. Here's the way you have to behave when an unpleasant customer comes in. And in general, this is how you have to live your life for most of your waking hours, down to the last detail. That's what's called having a job. Well, all of this is quite apart from the ingenious means that have been developed and devised over the years to control the lives of the subjects, from Taylorism, its origins back in the 19th century, control every motion that a working person makes, up to the devices that are being made available by modern technology. Managers might keep an eye on the workforce, and now it is the all-seeing eye of some remote computer, and innumerable other examples that are all too familiar, not only in the precarious gig economy, but in one way or another through the whole system of renting oneself for survival, holding a job, one of the highest goals in life. Well, that may be hegemonic common sense today, but it certainly has not been in the past. From classical antiquity right through the 19th century, the idea of being dependent on the will and the domination of others was considered an intolerable attack on elementary rights and human dignity. The hegemonic common sense of today is very recent development, matter worth pondering. In fact, all of this seemed so obviously correct that dependence on a master is intolerable, so obviously correct that it was a slogan of Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party, which regarded wage labor as differing from slavery only insofar as it was a temporary state until the person could gain freedom. But actually the most lively and eloquent and incisive condemnations and critiques were in the very vibrant labor press of the early Industrial Revolution, written by working people, including what were called the factory girls, young women from the farms who were driven to the mills in the rising industrial system. The Journal of the Knights of Labor, the great multinational, multiracial union of the 19th century America, held this main slogan that when a man is placed in a position where he is compelled to provide the benefits of his labor to another, he is in a condition of slavery. That was the standard assumption of working people, men and women, through the early years of the Industrial Revolution, right through the 19th century. One of the most articulate contributors to the working class protests against the reinstitution of a form of slavery in the rising industrial system, one of the most eloquent voices was an itinerant mechanic, Thomas Skidmore. Didn't have any formal education, but he was highly educated, like many others at the time. He developed a serious critique of wage slavery, founding it on the labor theory of value as it had been developed by the classic economists, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, with whose work he and others were familiar. And on that foundation, he defined slavery as, in his words, being compelled to labor while the proceeds of that labor is taken by others, and went on to argue at length that no matter how property rights are attained, they are illegitimate if they're used to make some dependent on others, allowing some to appropriate to themselves the labor of others. The General Labor Press extended and deepened these ideas. It was vocal and articulate. It condemned, quoting, the blasting influence of monarchical principles on democratic soil, referring to the wage contract. Workers recognized that this assault on basic human rights will not be overcome until those who, in their words, those who work in the mills will own them, and sovereignty will return to producers. Then, quoting, working people will no longer be menials or the humble subjects of a foreign despot, an absentee owner, so that they will be slaves in the strictest sense of the word, who toil for their masters. Rather, they will regain their citizens as free, their rights as status as free American citizens. It was recognized that the Industrial Revolution had introduced a crucial shift from price to wage. So when an artisan sells a product for a price, he retains his person. When he rents himself to a master, he sells himself. He loses his dignity as a person, becomes a wage slave in the terminology of the time. All of these ideas were very much alive, of course, after the formal abolition of chattel slavery. But in that context, the notion of wage slavery became very prominent. How is it different from chattel slavery? Well, the idea that productive enterprise should be owned by the workforce was pretty common coin all the way through the 19th century, and not just by Karl Marx and other left intellectuals, but also by the major exponents of classical liberalism. The idea was part of the classical liberal tradition of the time. One person who's brought this out eloquently in his recent work is David Ellerman in his studies of what he calls neo-abolitionism. He mentions John Stuart Mill, the most prominent classical liberal figure of the 19th century, one of the great modern intellectuals, Mill, argued that, I'm quoting him, the form of association which, if mankind continues to improve, must be expected to predominate is the association of the laborers themselves on terms of equality, collectively owning the capital with which they carry on their operations, working under managers electable and removable by themselves. In other words, democracy in the workplace. That's the form of association to which the human species will ascend if it continues to improve, according to the doctrines of 19th century classical liberalism. It's a concept that has very solid roots in the ideas that animated classical liberal thought from its earliest days, from John Locke, Adam Smith, and others. Some of the most eloquent and forceful development of these ideas was in the writings of Wilhelm von Humboldt, who was one of the founding figures of classical liberalism, also the founder of the modern research university. His words are worth thinking about, reading and thinking about carefully. They're far-reaching in their import. Humboldt held that freedom is the necessary condition without which even the most soul-satisfying occupation cannot produce any wholesome effects. Whatever task is not chosen by a man's free will, whatever constrains or even guides him, does not become part of his nature. It remains forever alien to him. If he performs it, he does it not with true humane energy, but with mere mechanical skill. Ideas, incidentally, which Humboldt also applied to the educational system in a manner which follows quite directly from the same thoughts. He went on to say that under the condition of freedom from external control, all peasants and craftsmen can be transformed into artists, that is, people who love their craft for its own sake and refine it with their self-guided energy and inventiveness, and who in so doing cultivate their own intellectual energies, ennoble their character, and increase their enjoyments. This way, humanity would be ennobled by the very things which now, however beautiful they might be, degraded. This urge for self-realization is man's basic human need from childhood, as distinct from mere animal needs. One who fails to recognize this ought justly to be suspected of failing to regard human nature as what it is and of wishing to turn men into machines. To determine whether the fundamental human rights are being honored, we must consider not just what a person does, but the conditions under which he does it, whether it is done under external control or spontaneously to fulfill a human need. If an artisan produces a beautiful work on command, we may admire what he does, but we despise what he is, an instrument in the hands of others, not a free human being. Adam Smith developed a very sharp critique of division of labor, and it's founded on the same principles. Smith argued that a person who performs the same task over and over on command will become as stupid and ignorant as a human being can be, an outcome that must be prevented by government action in any civilized society. Only work that is freely undertaken, using and enhancing one's own creative powers, is an acceptable social condition. And that's the foundation of classical liberal thought. It's a very short step from these principles to the idea of control of all institutions, all communities, within a framework of free association, federal free organization through agreed voluntary associations. Now that's the general style of very wide range of thought, including the main socialist traditions, the left anti-Bolshevik Marxists, much current activist work today of people seeking to gain control over their own lives and fate, spread of cooperatives, localization of agriculture, and many other initiatives of mutual aid, with the long-term goal of creating the kind of cooperative commonwealth that was the explicit ideal of working people and farmers through the early Industrial Revolution. Labor activists of the 19th century, late 19th century, warned of what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth, forgetting all but self. There have been massive efforts to instill this pernicious doctrine in people's heads. The huge advertising and marketing industries spend hundreds of billions of dollars a year to achieve this goal. Much of intellectual culture and education is directed to it, and all quite consciously. If you read the press of the highly class-conscious business world, it warns of what they call, quoting it now, the need to engage in the everlasting battle for the minds of men, to indoctrinate people with the capitalist story so deeply that they repeat it reflexively without thought. It should become common sense, mere common sense, to extol the merits of subordinating oneself to a master for one's waking life, to live a life of servitude to some foreign force. All of this was well understood by working people in the 19th century. In fact, workers in late 19th century New York warned that a day might come when wage slaves will so far forget what is due to manhood as to glory in a system forced on them by their necessity and in opposition to their feelings of independence and self-respect. They expressed their hope that that day would be far distant. In Gramscian terminology, they hoped to be able to block the efforts to instill a new hegemonic common sense in which workers would not only accept, but in fact glory in a system that turns them into menial and humble servants, as they put it, wage slaves under tight control, abandoning their independence for the larger part of their lives. Going back to the 19th century, in very sharp reaction to these efforts to impose submission to the masters, there were very important rising movements of working people, radical farmers in what was then, of course, largely an agrarian society. The farmers' movements began in Texas, moved up to Kansas, Oklahoma, Midwest generally, included most of the farmers, that's most of the working population. This is what was called the populist movement, not populism in the modern sense. This is traditional populism, radical democratic populism. Now, they were dedicated to solidarity, mutual aid. They created the most significant democratic movement in American history. Farmers developed cooperative institutions, cooperative banks, support programs, distribution programs. They wanted to escape the control of Northeastern bankers and the capitalist control of distributors. They had a good deal of success. Also, at the same time, that was true of workers in the industrializing Northeast. So in industrial areas of Western Pennsylvania, cities were run by democratically elected working class groups, instituted policies leading towards the cooperative commonwealth that was their joint ideal. There were efforts to link the major labor movement, the Knights of Labor, and the radical farmers of the populist movements. They were defeated, mostly by force and violence. The United States has an unusually violent labor history, much worse than comparable countries. It's to a very large extent a business-run society with a very highly class-conscious business class. But the battle is never over. There are setbacks, there's violent repression, intense efforts to beat these ideas of independence and dignity and self-respect out of people's minds. But the struggle goes on constantly.